Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. Prepare yourself for the last waltz at Meadowbank, a Miss Marple mystery that will leave you breathless until the final revelation. This tale of long-buried secrets will keep you guessing with each twist and turn as our beloved detective unravels one of her most emotionally charged investigations. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's ease into it. Miss Marple and the Last Waltz at Meadowbank. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Reminisce. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, secateurs in hand, tending to her beloved roses with the methodical care that characterized all her endeavors. The Morning Post lay unopened on the small, wrought-iron table beside her, waiting patiently as she finished her horticultural ministrations. It was only when she had trimmed the final wayward shoot that she removed her gardening gloves, settled into her chair, and reached for the small collection of envelopes. "Bills, I expect," she murmured to herself, "and perhaps a note from dear Raymond." But among the expected correspondence was an envelope of distinctly superior quality, addressed in an elegant, if somewhat tremulous hand that she recognized immediately. The return address confirmed her suspicion: Lady Agatha Westfield, Westfield Manor, Hampshire. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes brightened with interest. Lady Agatha had been a friend since their school days, though their paths had diverged considerably. Lady Agatha into the glittering world of society, and Miss Marple into the quieter, though no less eventful, life of St. Mary Mead. Their correspondence had become infrequent in recent years, making this unexpected letter all the more intriguing. She opened it carefully with the silver letter opener that had been her father's, and unfolded the heavy cream stationery. "My dearest Jane," the letter began, "I write to you with an invitation that I hope will intrigue you sufficiently to overcome your well-known reluctance to leave St. Mary Mead. A grand reunion concert is being held at Meadowbank next month, commemorating the orchestras that played during the darkest days of the war. Many of the surviving musicians will be performing, including the renowned Anton Varga, whose violin sustained so many of us through those terrible years." Miss Marple paused, recalling the name. Anton Varga had indeed been famous, a virtuoso who had escaped from occupied Europe and continued performing in England throughout the war. She had heard him play once, in London, a performance of such passion that it remained vivid in her memory decades later. "You may wonder," Lady Agatha's letter continued, "why I think this would appeal to you particularly. The music would be delightful, of course, but it is the human stories behind this gathering that I believe would fascinate you. These musicians carry histories as complex and telling as any of your village mysteries. Do say you'll come and stay with me for the week. Meadowbank is but a short drive from Westfield Manor, and I find myself craving both the music and your company." Miss Marple lowered the letter, her expression thoughtful. At her age, though she disliked dwelling on the number, travel had become something of an inconvenience. Yet there was something in Lady Agatha's invitation that stirred her curiosity. Musicians who had lived through the war, now reuniting after all these years. Yes, there would be stories there, perhaps even old grievances and secrets. "Very much like the church choir reunion last year," she murmured, recalling how old Mrs. Wilkins had refused to stand beside Mr. Harmon, still nursing a grudge over a solo opportunity from 1938. Human nature does not change regardless of the setting. Her decision was made by tea time. She wrote her acceptance, arranged for her neighbour Miss Weatherby to tend to her garden, and began the modest preparations for a week away from home. Her practical nature ensured that the preparations were neither excessive nor hurried. But by the time her train pulled into Hampshire Station the following week, Miss Marple was filled with a quiet anticipation. Lady Agatha met her at the station, a tall, still elegant woman whose aristocratic bearing had not diminished with age. Her silver hair was arranged in a fashionable style that Miss Marple privately thought a bit elaborate for day wear, but which suited her old friend's station in life. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful to see you!" Lady Agatha embraced her warmly. "You look remarkably well. Village life clearly agrees with you." "As does Hampshire with you, Agatha," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "Though I must confess I'm curious about this concert that has drawn you into such enthusiasm." During the drive to Westfield Manor, Lady Agatha elaborated on the reunion. Meadowbank was requisitioned during the war, you know, used for concerts to boost morale. The current owner, Henry Cunningham, has arranged this reunion as a sort of memorial. Many of the musicians have achieved considerable fame since then, Anton Varga particularly. "I remember hearing him play during the war," Miss Marple remarked. "A Hungarian, wasn't he?" "Czech, I believe," Lady Agatha corrected her, "though there's some dispute about his early years. The war scattered so many lives and records." She hesitated, then added in a lower tone, "Between us, Jane, there are some who question certain aspects of his success, whispers of melodies that weren't entirely his own." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Plagiarism is a serious accusation in artistic circles." "Indeed," Lady Agatha nodded, "but these are merely whispers. Varga's brilliance is undeniable, whatever its origins." They arrived at Westfield Manor, where Miss Marple was shown to a comfortable guest room. After refreshing herself, she joined Lady Agatha for tea in the garden, where their conversation inevitably returned to the upcoming concert. "We'll attend the first rehearsal tomorrow," Lady Agatha explained. "As patrons, we're permitted to observe. I think you'll find the dynamics instructive." The following morning found them at Meadowbank, a grand estate whose ballroom had been transformed into a concert hall. Miss Marple settled herself unobtrusively in a corner seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as the musicians assembled on the stage. Her eyes, however, missed nothing, not the tension in the shoulders of an elderly cellist as Anton Varga strode into the room, nor the way the famous violinist barely acknowledged his fellow performers. Varga himself was a commanding presence, tall, still handsome despite his years, with a full head of silver hair swept dramatically back from his forehead. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to admiration, yet there was something in his expression that gave Miss Marple pause, a wariness beneath the bravado perhaps, or a shadow of something less pleasant than artistic temperament. As the rehearsal began, Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her knitting. The music was beautiful, of course, but it was the human tableau before her that captured her attention. This gathering of aging musicians bound by shared history, yet divided by undercurrents she could not yet decipher, presented a puzzle as intricate as any she had encountered in St. Mary Mead. And Miss Marple had always had a particular talent for puzzles. Chapter 2. Discordant Notes. Miss Marple found the second day of rehearsals even more intriguing than the first. She had positioned herself in the same unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles working steadily on what would eventually become a scarf for her grandnephew, Raymond's little boy. Lady Agatha sat beside her, opera glasses occasionally raised, to examine the musicians more closely. "That's Maurice Hoffman on the cello," Lady Agatha whispered, indicating an elderly man whose posture remained remarkably straight despite his years. He and Varga played together before the war in Prague. Yeah, one of the few who knew Varga before he became the celebrated virtuoso of London. Miss Marple nodded, noting the way Hoffman's gaze followed Varga with an intensity that suggested far more than professional interest. It reminded her rather of old Mrs. Ellsworth, who had watched the new vicar with such scrutiny after he had replaced her favourite predecessor. Behind those watchful eyes had lurked decades of judgment and comparison. The morning rehearsal proceeded smoothly enough on the surface, though Miss Marple observed several minor confrontations. Anton Varga insisting on his interpretation of a passage, the conductor, Maestro Lawrence, deferring with what appeared to be reluctance, other musicians exchanging glances that spoke volumes. It was during the tea break that the underlying tensions became more apparent. Miss Marple, having accepted a cucumber sandwich and a cup of Earl Grey, positioned herself near a cluster of elderly musicians. Her unassuming presence, just another white-haired lady interested in music, rendered her practically invisible to them, a phenomenon she had found useful on many occasions. "He's changed nothing," Maurice Hoffman was saying, his English accented but precise. "Still the same Varga, taking everything for himself." "Hush, Maurice," cautioned a thin woman with an elegant neck that suggested she might be a fellow string player. "The past is the past. We are here to honor the music." "The music," Hoffman repeated with quiet bitterness. "Yes, the music. But whose music, I wonder?" The conversation shifted as Anton Varga himself approached their group, a champagne flute in his hand despite the early hour. He moved with the confidence of a performer, every gesture somehow calculated for effect. "My dear colleagues," he said, his rich baritone carrying just far enough for Miss Marple to hear. "How wonderful to reunite after these many years. Music has sustained us all, has it not?" The greetings he received in return were polite, but notably restrained. Miss Marple, observing from behind her teacup, was reminded of the time the Sanderson family had been forced to welcome back their prodigal cousin after he had inherited the family home they had tended for decades. The words had been cordial, the sentiments quite otherwise. "I particularly look forward to our performance of La Vie en Rose," Varga continued, seemingly oblivious to the cool reception. "It has always held a special place in my repertoire." At this, Maurice Hoffman's cup clattered slightly against its saucer. "Indeed," he said, his voice tight, "a special place, as it did for Jacob." A momentary silence fell over the group. Varga's smile remained fixed, but Miss Marple noticed how his fingers tightened around the stem of his champagne flute. "Jacob would have been pleased to know the piece still brings joy," Varga said finally, his tone just a fraction less assured. "Would he?" Hoffman challenged. "I wonder what else might have pleased Jacob Hartmann. To be remembered, perhaps, to be acknowledged?" Varga's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "We all suffered losses in the war, Maurice. Jacob more than most, I grant you. But surely this reunion should celebrate what survived, not what was lost." "Some things survive by stepping on others," Hoffman replied. "Some debts remain unpaid, some melodies—" "Excuse me," Varga cut in, his smile now brittle. "I see Maestro Lawrence signalling. We must resume." As he walked away, Miss Marple observed how the group of musicians watched him, some with obvious disapproval, others with expressions more difficult to interpret. What interested her particularly was a server, a grey-haired woman of perhaps 65, who had been unobtrusively clearing teacups nearby. The woman's eyes had never left Varga during the entire exchange, and there was something in her gaze that struck Miss Marple as significant. Not mere curiosity, but a focused intensity that seemed at odds with her role. The afternoon rehearsal proceeded with what Miss Marple perceived as increased tension. Varga's playing was flawless as ever, yet there was an edge to his performance now, a faint aggression in the way his bow attacked certain passages. Twice, Maestro Lawrence stopped the orchestra to suggest a more nuanced approach, and twice Varga acquiesced, with a graciousness that nevertheless hinted at impatience. "He's rather dominant, isn't he?" Miss Marple remarked quietly to Lady Agatha as they observed. "Always has been," Lady Agatha replied. "The war made many careers, Jane, but Vargas rose meteorically. By 1943, he was the darling of London's concert halls. His story of escaping Prague with nothing but his violin made him a symbol of resilience." "People do like stories of triumph over adversity," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking steadily. "Though I've observed that such stories are rarely as straightforward as they first appear." The rehearsal concluded with an announcement from Emily Preston, the event coordinator, regarding the schedule for the following day's dress rehearsal and the gala performance thereafter. As the musicians began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed Maurice Hoffman approach Varga once more. Though she was too far away to hear their exchange, the body language was unmistakable, Hoffman aggressive, despite his age, Varga dismissive, then increasingly irritated. "Perhaps we should go, Jane," Lady Agatha suggested, noting the confrontation. "The car will be waiting." But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else. The same server she had noticed earlier, now collecting abandoned programs and sheet music, had positioned herself just near enough to Varga and Hoffman to overhear their conversation. The woman's movements were efficient, but just slow enough to extend her presence in their vicinity. As they left the hall, Miss Marple glanced back to see Anton Varga striding toward his private dressing room, his expression thunderous. The confrontation had clearly left him unsettled, a fact confirmed when a young assistant hurried after him, only to emerge moments later, looking flustered. "Mr. Varga is not to be disturbed," the assistant announced to no one in particular. "He will resume rehearsal tomorrow." It was later that evening, as Miss Marple and Lady Agatha were enjoying a light supper at Westfield Manor, that the telephone rang. Lady Agatha's butler appeared in the doorway moments later, his usual impassivity slightly compromised. "Pardon the interruption, my lady, but there is a call from Meadowbank. It appears that there has been an incident regarding Mr. Varga." Lady Agatha raised her eyebrows. "What sort of incident, Hargraves?" "A threatening note, my lady, discovered in Mr. Varga's dressing room. The police have been notified." As Lady Agatha excused herself to take the call, Miss Marple set down her fork, her mind already sorting through the day's observations. Maurice Hoffman's bitter comments about stolen melodies and unpaid debts, the watchful server whose attention had never wavered from Varga, the tensions that seemed to simmer beneath the surface of what should have been a joyful reunion. In her experience, threatening notes rarely appeared in isolation. They were usually harbingers of darker intentions, the first movements of a symphony that too often culminated in violence. The tranquil celebration of musical camaraderie that Lady Agatha had described was revealing itself to be something altogether more complex and potentially dangerous. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her fingers working automatically as her mind processed the emerging pattern of human relationships and old resentments. She had seen enough of life to know that emotions suppressed for decades could be as volatile as any freshly ignited passion, perhaps more so, having fermented in silence for so long. Chapter 3. The performance begins. The evening of the gala concert arrived with all the anticipation and excitement that typically accompanied such prestigious events. Meadowbank had been transformed, its grand entrance hall illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the arriving guests. Ladies in evening gowns and gentlemen in black tie moved through the space with practiced elegance, their voices creating a gentle murmur that rose toward the ornate ceiling. Miss Marple, dressed in her best grey silk with a modest string of pearls that had been her mother's, sat beside Lady Agatha in the third row, close enough to observe the musicians' faces. She had taken particular care with her appearance this evening, not out of vanity. She had long since passed the age where such considerations held much importance, but because she had found that people tended to dismiss an elderly lady more readily if she appeared unkempt. "The threatening note has caused quite a stir," Lady Agatha murmured, nodding discreetly toward a uniformed policeman standing unobtrusively near one of the side exits. Henry Cunningham wanted to cancel the performance entirely, but Varga wouldn't hear of it. "Artists can be quite determined when it comes to their performances," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I recall the church organist in St. Mary Mead continued playing through a rather severe thunderstorm, even when the electricity threatened to fail. It's a kind of courage, I suppose, though some might call it stubbornness." She accepted a program from an usher and began to examine it with interest. The glossy booklet contained photographs of the original wartime orchestra, alongside brief biographies of the current performers. Anton Varga's occupied a full page, detailing his escape from occupied Prague and subsequent rise to fame in London's concert halls. His biography makes no mention of Jakob Hartmann, Miss Marple noted, recalling Maurice Hoffman's pointed comments from the day before, though I observe there is a memorial section for musicians lost during the war. She turned to this section where a list of names appeared under the heading "In Remembrance." Each name was accompanied by their instrument and, when known, the date and place of their death. Jakob Hartmann was listed among them. Violin, Prague, 1943. Below the list was a small dedication, "In memory of those whose music was silenced too soon. We play on, carrying your melodies in our hearts. Pour toujours." "Pour toujours," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Forever. A touching sentiment." She continued reading, but her attention was caught by something in the phrasing, something that struck her as slightly odd, though she couldn't immediately identify what it might be. Before she could consider it further, the house lights dimmed and the musicians filed onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. Maestro Lawrence appeared last, followed by Anton Varga, who was greeted with particular enthusiasm. Varga acknowledged the applause with a practiced bow, his silver hair gleaming under the stage lights. Miss Marple noticed that despite his composed exterior, there was a certain tightness around his eyes and mouth that suggested the strain of the past day's events. The first half of the concert was devoted to classical pieces that had been popular during the war years, selections from Mozart, Beethoven, and Elgar that had lifted spirits during the darkest days of the conflict. The orchestra performed beautifully, and Varga's solos were met with rapturous appreciation. "He truly is exceptional," Lady Agatha whispered during one particularly moving passage. Whatever else one might say about him. Miss Marple nodded in agreement, though her attention was divided between the music and her observations of the performers. Maurice Hoffmann played with technical precision, but a certain emotional restraint, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Varga with that same intensity she had noted before. The other musicians, too, seemed to relate to their star violinist with varying degrees of deference and reservation. The intermission arrived, and the audience moved into the adjacent reception room where champagne was being served. Miss Marple and Lady Agatha followed more slowly, Miss Marple leaning slightly on her friend's arm. "Ah, there's Henry Cunningham," Lady Agatha said, indicating a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who was conversing with several local dignitaries. "We really should say hello, Jane. He's put so much effort into organizing this reunion." As they made their way across the room, Miss Marple noticed the grey-haired server again, efficiently distributing champagne flutes from a silver tray. The woman moved with purpose through the crowd, her expression pleasant but unremarkable. Yet there was something in her eyes when they briefly rested on Anton Varga, who was now holding court among a group of admirers, that caught Miss Marple's attention. A fleeting intensity quickly masked but reminiscent of something she had seen before in very different circumstances. "My dear Lady Agatha," Henry Cunningham greeted them warmly, "and this must be your friend Miss Marple. I understand you're quite the music enthusiast." "Oh, I wouldn't claim any expertise," Miss Marple demurred, "but I do appreciate beautiful music, especially when it carries such historical significance." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a spoon tapping against glass. Anton Varga had moved to the center of the room and was preparing to address the gathering. "Distinguished guests," he began, his rich voice carrying easily without need of amplification. "It is my great honor to be part of this commemoration. Many of us on stage tonight carry memories of those dark years, some glorious, many painful. Music was our solace, our weapon against despair." He paused, his expression growing more solemn. "In the second half of our program, we will perform pieces that have particular significance to the wartime experience. Among them will be La Vie en Rose, which became an unexpected favorite among audiences seeking a reminder that even in darkness, love endures." At these words, Miss Marple noticed Maurice Hoffman's expression harden, his hand tightening around his champagne glass. Nearby, the server she had been observing paused momentarily in her movements. "Before we continue," Varga went on, raising his own champagne flute, "I would like to propose a toast to those who are no longer with us, whose music lives on in our performances." The assembled guests raised their glasses. Varga tilted his flute toward his lips, then suddenly froze. A strange expression crossed his face, confusion followed rapidly by alarm. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished floor as he clutched at his throat. For a moment the gathering remained still, as if watching a performance that had taken an unexpected turn. Then Varga staggered forward, his face contorting in obvious distress. "Is there a doctor?" someone called, breaking the shocked silence. A middle-aged man pushed through the crowd. "Dr. Morrison, let me through, please." Miss Marple observed the unfolding scene with a clarity born of having witnessed human crisis many times before. She noted how quickly Varga's condition deteriorated, the bluish tinge that spread across his features, the increasingly desperate gasps as he fought for breath. She observed, too, the reactions of those around him, shock and confusion predominating, but with subtle variations that might prove significant. Dr. Morrison knelt beside the collapsed violinist, his action swift and professional, but even from where she stood, Miss Marple could see that his efforts were futile. Anton Varga's body had gone rigid, his eyes staring sightlessly toward the ornate ceiling. "My God," Henry Cunningham whispered. "Is he—" "I'm afraid so," Dr. Morrison confirmed grimly, rising to his feet. "He's gone." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "and given the symptoms and the rapidity of onset, I strongly suspect poison." A collective gasp moved through the assembly. Miss Marple's gaze travelled across the room, noting the server who had now retreated to a corner, her tray still half full of untouched champagne flutes. Their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple was struck by the complex emotion visible in the other woman's face. Not shock, precisely, but something deeper and more profound, like the final notes of a tragic symphony that had been building toward its inevitable conclusion for many years. The sound of running footsteps announced the arrival of the policeman who had been stationed at the exit. The pleasant social gathering had transformed in moments into the scene of what appeared to be a deliberate and coldly efficient murder. As the initial chaos subsided into a more organized response, with guests being asked to remain while authorities were contacted, Miss Marple stood quietly beside Lady Agatha, her mind already beginning to arrange the disjointed observations and impressions of the past 2 days into a pattern that might illuminate the darkness that had culminated in this tragic moment. Chapter 4. Village Parallels. The grand music hall at Meadowbank had transformed dramatically in the hours following Anton Varga's collapse. Where there had been elegance and anticipation, now there was the methodical efficiency of a police investigation. The guests had been moved to an adjacent drawing room where they sat in clusters, their evening finery incongruous with the gravity of the situation. Miss Marple, seated beside Lady Agatha on a small settee, observed it all with quiet attention. Inspector Graves had arrived promptly, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed moustache and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many disruptions to festive occasions. It reminds me rather of the time Mrs. Enderby's ruby necklace disappeared during the church bazaar, Miss Marple remarked softly to Lady Agatha. Everyone gathered in the parish hall, looking so uncomfortable in their Sunday best, while Constable Rogers questioned them one by one. Lady Agatha patted her friend's hand. "I doubt Inspector Graves will be concerned with your village parallels, Jane. This is murder, after all." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Though human nature remains remarkably consistent whether in St. Mary Mead or Meadowbank." They watched as Inspector Graves spoke with Dr. Morrison, who was gesturing emphatically as he explained something. Nearby, a younger officer was taking meticulous notes. "Your attention, please," Inspector Graves addressed the room at last. "I am Inspector Richard Graves of the Hampshire Constabulary. As you're all aware, Mr. Anton Varga appears to have died under suspicious circumstances. Dr. Morrison has suggested poison as the likely cause, though we await confirmation. We will need statements from everyone present, starting with those closest to Mr. Varga at the time of his collapse." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathering. Miss Marple noticed Maurice Hoffman sitting apart from the other musicians, his expression closed and unreadable. Nearby sat a strikingly beautiful woman in her early 30s, dressed in an elegant black gown that Miss Marple suspected cost more than her entire wardrobe. The young woman dabbed occasionally at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her face remained curiously composed. "That's Eloise Varga?" Lady Agatha whispered, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Anton's wife of 5 years, his third, I believe. There was quite a stir when they married, the age difference, you know." Miss Marple nodded, noting how Mrs. Varga's eyes moved calculatingly around the room despite her performance of grief. It reminded her of young Mrs. Simmons back home, who had worn her widow's weeds with similar precision after old Mr. Simmons had succumbed to what the village doctor had called natural causes, though there had been talk. Her observations were interrupted as Inspector Graves approached them. "Lady Westfield," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "And you would be Miss Marple. I understand you were guests of honour this evening." "Hardly that, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with a modest smile. "Simply old friends enjoying a cultural evening." "Indeed. And did either of you notice anything unusual about Mr. Varga this evening? Any strange behaviour, perhaps, or individuals paying him particular attention?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Mr. Varga seemed slightly tense, I thought, though that might be attributed to the threatening note he'd received yesterday." Inspector Graves's eyebrows rose fractionally. "You were aware of that incident?" "News travels quickly in these circumstances," Lady Agatha interjected smoothly. "The musicians have been discussing little else." "I see." The inspector made a note. "And did you observe who served Mr. Varga his champagne?" "There was a server circulating with a tray," Miss Marple said carefully. "A woman with grey hair, perhaps in her 60s. I believe she was the one who offered Mr. Varga his glass, though several servers were moving through the crowd. She did not mention her previous observations of the same woman, nor the intensity with which she had watched Varga." "There was time enough for that, once she had sorted her impressions more thoroughly. "Thank you, ladies. Please remain available for further questions." As Inspector Graves moved away, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the doorway, where a police sergeant was speaking to one of the event staff. The conversation appeared tense, the staff member gesturing apologetically. "I believe they've discovered the server has disappeared," Miss Marple murmured. Lady Agatha looked startled. "How could you possibly know that?" "One observes these things," Miss Marple replied mildly. "The sergeant has been questioning the staff about their colleagues, and that particular young man, the one in the burgundy waistcoat, has been growing increasingly distressed. It suggests someone is unaccounted for." Before Lady Agatha could respond, Inspector Graves's voice rose above the murmur of conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for your continued patience. It appears that cyanide poisoning is the likely cause of Mr. Varga's death. The poison was almost certainly in his champagne glass, which means this was a deliberate act." The announcement produced the expected shock, though Miss Marple noted that several individuals, including Maurice Hoffman and, interestingly, Victorino, the rival violinist, seemed less surprised than others. Furthermore, the inspector continued, "We are currently trying to locate a member of the serving staff who appears to have left the premises shortly after Mr. Varga's collapse. If anyone has any information regarding this individual, please come forward." As the investigation continued into the evening, Miss Marple found her thoughts drifting to a case from St. Mary Mead some years earlier. Old Mr. Jefferson, the church organist, had harboured a decades-long resentment against the choirmaster who had once stolen credit for his composition. The bitterness had festered silently until one Christmas Eve, when the choirmaster's tea had been laced with a dangerous dose of digitalis. "You know, Agatha," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "this reminds me rather of poor Mr. Jefferson." "Who on earth is Mr. Jefferson?" Lady Agatha asked, clearly puzzled by the non sequitur. Miss Marple explained the parallel briefly, concluding, "It was the silence of his resentment that made it so dangerous, you see. Everyone thought he had forgotten or forgiven, but in truth, the grievance had only grown stronger with time. Rather like a splinter that festers beneath the skin. Invisible, but increasingly painful." "Are you suggesting this murder has something to do with an old grievance against Varga?" Lady Agatha asked. "I'm merely observing that long-buried resentments can be the most dangerous kind," Miss Marple replied. "Particularly when they involve artistic credit. Musicians, like writers, can be terribly possessive about their work." Their conversation was interrupted when a young constable approached, informing them that Inspector Graves wished to speak with Miss Marple again. She followed the young man to a small study that had been repurposed as a temporary interview room. Inspector Graves looked up from a folder of papers as she entered. Beside him on the desk lay a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a photograph. "Miss Marple, thank you for your patience. I understand from Lady Westfield that you have some experience with unusual deaths." "I have lived in the same village for many years, Inspector," Miss Marple replied modestly. "One observes patterns in human behaviour over time." The inspector's expression suggested scepticism, but he merely nodded and held up the evidence bag. "This was found among Mr. Varga's personal belongings in his dressing room. I'd be interested in your impression." Miss Marple accepted the bag and examined its contents carefully. The photograph was old, its edges worn and creased from frequent handling. It showed a young couple, a handsome man who was recognizably a youthful Anton Varga, and a beautiful dark-haired woman with large expressive eyes. She wore a simple white blouse, and around her neck hung a distinctive locket in the shape of a violin. "They look very much in love," Miss Marple observed, noting the way the young woman gazed at Varga. "The photograph appears to be from before the war, judging by the style of dress and the quality of the image." Indeed. Inspector Graves took back the evidence bag. We believe the woman is Clara Hartmann, sister to the violinist Jakob Hartmann, who was mentioned in the concert program. Both apparently knew Varga in Prague before the war. How interesting, Miss Marple said. And this Clara Hartmann, do we know what became of her? That's just it, the inspector replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. Records from that period are incomplete at best. Jakob Hartmann died in 1943, presumably in a concentration camp. His sister's fate is unknown. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The photograph had stirred something in her memory, a fleeting impression that she couldn't quite grasp. There was something about the woman's face, or perhaps the distinctive locket she wore. As she returned to Lady Agatha's side, Miss Marple's mind was working steadily through the accumulating facts and impressions. A famous violinist with a past that held secrets, a threatening note, a bitter colleague speaking of stolen melodies and unpaid debts. A mysterious server who disappeared at the crucial moment, and now a cherished photograph of a woman from long ago wearing a violin-shaped locket. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though crucial elements remained obscured. Miss Marple had no doubt, however, that like her knitting, which began as separate strands of wool and gradually took recognizable form, the truth would eventually emerge from these tangled threads of past and present. Chapter 5. Echoes from the Past. The morning after Anton Varga's death dawned grey and misty, a fitting backdrop to the sombre mood that had settled over Meadowbank. Miss Marple, dressed in her customary neat tweed, sat at Lady Agatha's breakfast table, methodically spreading marmalade on her toast as she considered the events of the previous evening. Inspector Graves has requested that all the musicians remain available for questioning, Lady Agatha remarked, scanning a note that had been delivered with the morning post. The concert has been officially cancelled, of course, but they're not permitted to leave the area. A sensible precaution, Miss Marple agreed, though I imagine it will cause considerable inconvenience for those with professional engagements elsewhere. Jane, Lady Agatha set down her cup with a slight frown. You've had that particular expression all morning, the one that suggests you're working through some puzzle. What is it you're thinking? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I was just recalling something Maurice Hoffman said during his confrontation with Mr. Varga. He mentioned someone named Jakob, and there was quite a significant reaction from Mr. Varga, a tensing, a momentary loss of his composure. And then there's the photograph found among his possessions, showing him with Jakob's sister Clara. You think there's a connection to the murder? I think, Miss Marple replied carefully, that when a man keeps a photograph for over 40 years, it suggests a relationship of some significance, and when that same man reacts strongly to the mention of the woman's brother, it suggests a history that might be relevant to our current circumstances. Lady Agatha considered this. Several of the older musicians knew Varga before the war. Perhaps one of them could shed some light on this Jakob and Clara. My thoughts precisely, Miss Marple agreed. I wonder if we might pay a visit to Meadowbank this morning, for the purpose of collecting your sheet music, of course, which you left behind in the confusion. The strategy proved effective. Upon arriving at Meadowbank, they discovered several of the musicians gathered in the small conservatory, speaking in low voices that fell silent as they entered. Among them was Maurice Hoffman, looking haggard but composed, and an elderly woman whom Lady Agatha identified as Beatrice Shaw, a violist who had played with the wartime orchestra. Lady Westfield, Maurice acknowledged with a slight bow. Miss Marple, a terrible business this. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, a shocking end to what should have been a celebration of survival and music. A bitter smile crossed Maurice's face. Survival, yes. Some survived by different means than others. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before Mrs. Shaw spoke up. "I believe you left your music folio here last night, Lady Westfield. Emily placed all the guests' belongings in the small anteroom. Shall I show you?" As Lady Agatha followed Mrs. Shaw, Miss Marple found herself alone with Maurice Hoffman. She settled carefully onto a nearby chair, arranging her handbag on her lap with deliberate movements. "You knew Mr. Varga for many years, I understand," she began. "Since conservatory days in Prague," Hoffman confirmed. "Before the war changed everything." "War has a way of revealing character," Miss Marple observed. "In St. Mary Mead, my village, we had a young man who seemed quite ordinary until he returned from the war with a Distinguished Service Cross. No one had suspected such courage in him." She paused. "And conversely, there was Mr. Pilgrim, who had always been so respected until rationing revealed his willingness to profit from others' hardship." Maurice studied her with new interest. "You're suggesting Varga's true character was revealed during the war?" "I'm merely observing that difficult times often show us who people truly are," Miss Marple replied mildly. "You mentioned someone named Jakob yesterday. I couldn't help noticing Mr. Varga's reaction." A shadow crossed Maurice's face. "Jakob Hartmann, a brilliant violinist, more gifted than Anton, though less ambitious. They were friends, rivals, and eventually—" He trailed off, seeming to reconsider his words. "Eventually?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Eventually enemies," Maurice finished. "There was a woman, Jakob's sister Clara. Both men loved her, but she chose Jakob's friend. A terrible mistake, as it turned out." "How so?" Maurice's expression hardened. "When the Germans came, many musicians tried to flee. Arrangements were made, papers forged. Jakob was to escape with his sister, but at the last moment he was arrested. Someone had informed him." "Mr. Varga?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "It was never proven," Maurice replied, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "But Anton left Prague that same week, carrying a case full of music compositions. By the time he reached London, some of those compositions had mysteriously become his own work, including a particularly beautiful arrangement of La Vie en Rose that had been Jakob's signature piece. And Jakob's sister, Clara? What became of her?" Maurice shook his head. "She disappeared during the chaos. Some said she died in the camps like her brother. Others believed she escaped to Switzerland. Anton claimed to have lost track of her during the evacuation." His tone made it clear how little he credited this claim. Miss Marple considered this information, her knitting needles clicking softly as she absorbed the implications. "It must have been difficult for you, working with Mr. Varga after harbouring such suspicions." "I avoided him for decades," Maurice admitted. "This reunion was the first time many of us had seen him since the war. Some refused to come at all." Their conversation was interrupted as Lady Agatha returned with her recovered music folio. Shortly thereafter, they took their leave, but not before Miss Marple had exchanged a few words with Mrs. Shaw, who had known both Clara and Jakob Hartmann before the war. "They were inseparable, those two," the elderly violist recalled, a distant look in her eyes. "Clara was not a musician herself, but she had an extraordinary ear. She could identify any composition from just a few notes. Jakob adored her. They had only each other after their parents died." "And her relationship with Anton Varga?" Miss Marple inquired. A flicker of something, disapproval perhaps, or an old anger, crossed Mrs. Shaw's face. "Clara was young, impressionable. Anton had a certain charisma, a way of making promises seem like certainties. He gave her a locket, shaped like a violin, with an inscription inside. 'Pour toujours,' it said, 'forever.'" She laughed shortly. His forever lasted until the first sign of trouble. As they drove back to Westfield Manor, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the concert programme she had examined the previous evening. There had been something about the memorial dedication that had struck her as odd. The same phrase, pour toujours, had appeared there as well. "Agatha," she said, suddenly, "do you still have your programme from last night?" Lady Agatha nodded toward her music folio. "It should be there with my sheet music. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple retrieved the glossy booklet and turned to the memorial page. Yes, there it was, the dedication ending with pour toujours. She studied it more carefully this time, her lips moving slightly as she read. "How curious," she murmured. "What is it, Jane?" "Oh, merely a small detail," Miss Marple replied. Probably of no significance. But her expression suggested otherwise, and Lady Agatha knew her friend too well to press the matter. Miss Marple would speak when she had arranged her thoughts to her satisfaction, and not before. Upon their return, they found a message waiting from Inspector Graves, requesting Miss Marple's presence at Meadowbank that afternoon. The inspector had established a temporary office in the estate's library and was surrounded by papers when she arrived. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," he greeted her. "I understand you've been making inquiries of your own among the musicians." "Merely conversation," Miss Marple demurred. "One cannot help being curious about such a tragic event." Inspector Graves regarded her thoughtfully. "Lady Westfield speaks highly of your intuition in such matters. I wonder if you might share your impressions." "I hardly think my impressions would be of value to a professional investigation," Miss Marple replied with appropriate modesty. "Though I must say the situation reminds me somewhat of the case of the choirmaster's bell." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "The choirmaster's bell?" "A case in St. Mary Mead some years ago," Miss Marple explained. "A choirmaster was found dead, apparently from heart failure, after ringing the church bell. It later emerged that the bell rope had been coated with a substance to which he was violently allergic, applied by someone who had waited decades to exact revenge for a youthful betrayal." She smoothed her skirt. The remarkable thing was that everyone knew of this ancient grievance, yet no one considered it a possible motive, because so much time had passed. "But some injuries, Inspector, are not diminished by time. Rather, they grow sharper with each passing year, like a thorn that works its way deeper into the flesh." Before Inspector Graves could respond, a constable entered with a file. "Sir, the lab results on the champagne glass. It was definitely cyanide, and it appears to have been present only in Mr. Varga's glass, not in the general supply." "So our poisoner targeted him specifically," the inspector mused. "That narrows the field considerably." "Have you had any success locating the missing server?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not yet, though we have a name. Elizabeth Gray, hired through an agency just for this event, apparently. The address she provided has proven to be false." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you might find interesting." "We've been examining Mr. Varga's personal effects more thoroughly. That photograph you saw? There was an inscription on the back. Clara and Anton, Prague, 1938. And beneath it, in a different hand, pour toujours." Miss Marple's fingers stilled momentarily on her handbag. The pieces were beginning to align themselves in her mind. Not yet a complete picture, but a pattern emerging from what had previously seemed disconnected elements. As she left Meadowbank, the afternoon sunlight briefly broke through the clouds, illuminating the grand old house in a golden glow that belied the darkness of the events that had transpired within its walls. Miss Marple paused on the gravel drive, her gaze drawn to a small figure making its way toward the village, a grey-haired woman walking with purpose, her posture straight despite her years. Miss Marple watched until the woman disappeared around a bend in the road, then continued to Lady Agatha's waiting car, her mind already formulating a plan for the following day. Chapter 6. The Missing Melody. The village of Little Meadow nestled in the valley below Meadowbank, its stone cottages and neat gardens presenting a picture of tranquillity that seemed removed from the drama unfolding at the estate. Miss Marple had persuaded Lady Agatha's chauffeur to drop her in the village square, insisting that a morning walk would do her good and that she could easily find her way back later. "I have some small errands," she had explained vaguely, "and I've always found that village shops often contain the most interesting conversations." The chauffeur, who had been instructed by Lady Agatha to accommodate Miss Marple's wishes, departed with a polite tip of his cap. Miss Marple stood for a moment, orienting herself in the unfamiliar surroundings. A small tea-room, a greengrocer, the inevitable village pub, and, her attention sharpened, a bookshop tucked between the post office and a bakery. "Hartman Books?" she read aloud, noting the small, tasteful sign above the door. The coincidence of the name was too significant to ignore. A bell tinkled softly as she entered, announcing her presence in the quiet shop. The interior was comfortably appointed with oak shelves and reading nooks, the scent of old paper and leather bindings creating an atmosphere of scholarly tranquillity. At first, the shop appeared empty, but then a movement from behind a tall display caught her attention. "Good morning," a voice called, and a grey-haired woman emerged, carrying a stack of books. "May I help you find something specific?" It was, as Miss Marple had suspected, the server from Meadowbank, the woman who had disappeared immediately after Anton Varga's collapse. Seen in daylight, her features were more distinct, high cheekbones, deep-set eyes that must once have been striking, and a certain dignity in her bearing that no amount of grey hair or life's hardships had erased. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied with her most benign smile. "I'm just browsing, really. I find that bookshops are such wonderful places for discovering unexpected treasures." "Indeed they are," the woman agreed, setting down her stack on a nearby table. Her accent was faint but detectable. Central European, Miss Marple guessed, softened by decades in England. "Please take your time. We have quite a good collection of mysteries, if those interest you." "How perfect," Miss Marple exclaimed. "I do enjoy a good mystery. The human elements are so fascinating, don't you think? The secrets, the motives, the old wounds that never quite heal." A flicker of something, wariness perhaps, passed across the woman's face, but she merely nodded and moved to arrange the books she had been carrying. Miss Marple drifted toward a shelf of classical literature, maintaining a conversational tone. "I was at the most extraordinary concert at Meadowbank last night, or rather, what should have been a concert. Such a tragedy about Mr. Varga." The woman's hands stilled momentarily on the books. "Yes, I heard something about that. Very sad." "You weren't there, then?" Miss Marple asked innocently. A brief hesitation. "No, I wasn't." "How curious," Miss Marple mused. "I could have sworn I saw someone very like you serving champagne, but perhaps I was mistaken. At my age, one's eyesight isn't what it once was." The woman turned to face her fully, her expression now guarded. "Is there a particular book you're looking for, madam?" "I've always had an interest in music," Miss Marple replied, changing tack smoothly. "Especially pieces with emotional significance. La Vie en Rose, for instance. Such a beautiful melody. I understand it was to be performed last night as part of the program." At the mention of the song, the woman's composure slipped visibly. Her hand went unconsciously to her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her blouse. "A lovely piece," she agreed, her voice slightly strained. "Though I confess I'm not particularly musical myself." "No? How interesting. I found that music often holds such powerful memories, especially from our youth." It can transport us back to specific moments, remind us of people we've loved and lost. Miss Marple moved closer to a display of music books. Were you perhaps acquainted with Mr. Varga in earlier days, before he became so famous? I think there's been some misunderstanding, the woman said, her voice firmer now. I didn't know Mr. Varga, and I wasn't at Meadowbank last night. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have inventory to complete. She retreated behind the counter, effectively ending the conversation. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and turned her attention to the books, though her mind was working steadily through the implications of the woman's reactions. After purchasing a slim volume of poetry, more as a pretext than out of genuine interest, Miss Marple departed, noting the shop's hours posted on the door. The bookshop closed at 5. She would return to speak with Lady Agatha's chauffeur about collecting her later. As she stepped onto the village street, her gaze was drawn to a man entering the post office across the way, Inspector Graves apparently following the same investigative path she had intuited. Their eyes met briefly, and the inspector nodded in acknowledgement before disappearing inside. Miss Marple continued her exploration of the village, gathering impressions and fragments of information as she went. At the tea-room, where she stopped for a restorative cup of Darjeeling, she engaged the proprietress in conversation. "Such a charming bookshop you have in the village," she remarked. "Has it been here long?" "Hartman Books?" "Oh, not above 5 years," the woman replied as she poured the tea. "Miss Hartman opened it after moving here from London, keeps to herself mostly, but very knowledgeable about literature, runs a reading group for the children on Saturday mornings." "Miss Hartman lives alone then?" "Yes, in the cottage behind the shop. Never married, from what I understand." The proprietress lowered her voice. "There's a sadness about her, though she's pleasant enough. My Herbert says she reminds him of those displaced persons after the war, those who'd lost everything but carried on somehow." The conversation shifted to other village matters, but Miss Marple had obtained what she sought, confirmation of the woman's identity and living situation. As she finished her tea, she noticed through the window that Inspector Graves had emerged from the post office and was now heading toward Hartman Books. Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple was being driven back to Westfield Manor, the chauffeur mentioned that there had been further developments in the investigation. "A second threatening note was found in Mr. Varga's hotel room, miss," he informed her. "The housekeeping staff discovered it this morning when packing his belongings. There's talk in the village that it might have been sent by a jealous colleague." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The case was taking shape in her mind, the disparate elements gradually arranging themselves into a coherent pattern. What had begun to emerge was a tragedy spanning decades, a story of love and betrayal, of music silenced and vengeance long deferred. As they passed the turning to Little Meadow, she caught a glimpse of Clara Hartman's bookshop in the distance, its windows now dark in the gathering dusk. Within those walls, she suspected, lay the final pieces of the puzzle, a locket with an inscription, a lifetime of grief, and the missing melody that connected past to present. Chapter 7. Variations on a Theme. The investigation into Anton Varga's death had intensified markedly by the following morning. Miss Marple, taking breakfast with Lady Agatha, listened with interest as her friend related the latest developments. "Inspector Graves has been questioning Eloise Varga for hours," Lady Agatha reported, buttering her toast with precise movements. "The general feeling is that she's become the primary suspect. It seems Anton had changed his will recently, leaving everything to her rather than to various musical charities as previously arranged." "How very convenient," Miss Marple remarked, mildly. "Though money is rarely as straightforward a motive as it appears. I recall poor Mrs. Wilson in St. Mary Mead. Everyone assumed her nephew had poisoned her for the inheritance, when in fact it was her companion who couldn't bear the thought of being dismissed after 20 years of service. "Jane, you're not suggesting Mrs. Varga is innocent?" Lady Agatha looked surprised. "I'm merely observing that investigators often seize upon the most obvious solution," Miss Marple replied. "There's Victor Renault as well. I understand he and Mr. Varga had a rather public disagreement about an upcoming position with the London Philharmonic." Lady Agatha nodded. "Victor claims Anton used his influence to block his appointment. There's certainly no love lost between them." She hesitated. "But Jane, what about that server you were so interested in, the one who disappeared after Anton collapsed?" "Miss Hartman," Miss Marple confirmed. "Yes, I believe Inspector Graves has been making inquiries in that direction as well. I wonder—" She paused, considering. "Agatha, do you happen to have any of the original correspondence about this reunion? Letters, perhaps, regarding the program or arrangements?" Lady Agatha looked puzzled, but nodded. "Henry Cunningham copied me on most of the planning materials as a courtesy. They should be in my study." An hour later, Miss Marple sat at Lady Agatha's desk, carefully reviewing a folder of letters and program drafts related to the Meadowbank reunion. Her attention was particularly focused on the memorial section that had appeared in the final program. "How very interesting," she murmured, comparing two versions of the text. In an earlier draft, the dedication read simply, "In memory of those whose music was silenced too soon. We play on, carrying your melodies in our hearts, forever." In the final version, however, forever had been replaced with pour toujours, the same French phrase that had been inscribed in Clara's locket from Anton. "May I use your telephone, Agatha?" Miss Marple asked. "I believe I should speak with Inspector Graves." The conversation with the inspector was brief, but productive. Miss Marple shared her observation about the program dedication, carefully framing it as a curious coincidence rather than a definitive clue. "Most interesting, Miss Marple," the inspector acknowledged. "As it happens, we've been examining the production process for the program. It seems the final proofs were reviewed by several people, including Emily Preston, and, interestingly, a local typesetter recommended by one of the village shopkeepers, specifically the owner of Hartman Books." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And have you had any success locating Miss Hartman? I understand she wasn't at her shop this morning when I passed by." "No, but we're keeping an eye on the premises," the inspector replied. "There's something else you might find relevant. We've interviewed the agency that provided staff for the event. Their records show no Elizabeth Gray on their books. Whoever our missing server was, she didn't come through official channels." After concluding the call, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence. The pieces were aligning themselves with increasing clarity. Clara Hartman, survivor of unimaginable trauma, had orchestrated her own presence at the reunion concert, possibly with the specific intention of confronting the man who had betrayed her brother and abandoned her to her fate. But was it murder she had planned from the beginning? Or had something during the event itself pushed her toward that irrevocable action? Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by Lady Agatha's return. "Jane, Henry Cunningham has just telephoned. They're arranging a memorial service for Anton tomorrow afternoon at Meadowbank, a small private affair for the musicians and special guests. We're invited, of course." "How appropriate," Miss Marple nodded. "Will there be music?" "Yes, several of the musicians have volunteered to perform pieces that were significant to Anton's career. That arrangement of La Vie en Rose is to be the centerpiece, performed by Maurice Hoffman." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Maurice Hoffman? Not Victor Renault?" Victor refused, apparently, said he couldn't bring himself to play what he called stolen music. Rather dramatic of him, I thought. Later that afternoon, having arranged to meet with Inspector Graves at Meadowbank to examine some additional evidence, Miss Marple found herself once again in the village of Little Meadow. The chauffeur had dropped her early, giving her time for what she described as a bit of shopping before her appointment. Hartman Books was open, the small bell announcing her entrance just as it had the day before. Clara Hartman looked up from behind the counter, recognition and wariness visible in her expression. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple greeted her pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind my returning. I found such a lovely volume yesterday that I thought I might look for a companion piece." Clara nodded stiffly. "Of course. Please browse as you wish." Rather than moving to the shelves, Miss Marple approached the counter. "I understand there's to be a memorial service for Mr. Varga tomorrow. Will you be attending, Miss Hartman?" The direct question caught Clara off guard. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, where the chain of her locket was just visible above her blouse collar. "I have no connection to Mr. Varga," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Why would I attend his memorial?" "Perhaps because of Jacob," Miss Marple suggested softly. "Or because of the music that was silenced too soon. Pour toujours." Clara's face paled visibly. For a moment it seemed she might deny everything, but then a subtle shift occurred in her posture, a release of tension, as if a decision had been made. "You seem to know a great deal, Miss Marple, Jane Marple. And yes, I have pieced together certain aspects of this sad history. But there are elements I still don't understand, particularly why Mr. Varga kept your photograph all these years, and why he appears to have been searching for you recently." Surprise registered in Clara's eyes. "Searching for me?" "No, that's not possible. Anton made his choice in Prague. He chose his career over." She stopped abruptly. "Over you and Jacob?" Miss Marple completed gently. "And yet, according to what I have heard, he had been making inquiries about survivors from the Prague Conservatory, specifically about the Hartman family." Clara's expression grew troubled. "I don't believe it. After what he did—" She broke off, seeming to realize she had said too much. Miss Marple regarded her with compassion. "Miss Hartman, I don't presume to judge the actions of those terrible years, nor the lasting wounds they inflicted, but I wonder if you might consider attending tomorrow's service, not for Anton's sake, but for your own. Some melodies need to reach their proper conclusion before we can truly move forward." She departed shortly thereafter, leaving Clara standing silent and thoughtful behind her counter. As Miss Marple made her way to meet Inspector Graves, the pattern of the case had crystallized in her mind, not just the how and who of Anton Varga's death, but the why which stretched back through decades of silence and sorrow to a betrayal in wartime Prague. What remained uncertain was how justice could properly be served in a case where the original crime had gone unpunished for so long, and where the final act of vengeance had emerged from wounds too deep for time to heal. Chapter 8. The Final Movement. The memorial service for Anton Varga was held in the same grand hall where, only days before, he had stood acknowledged as a master of his art. Now the space had been transformed, the concert seating rearranged to create a more intimate setting. Vases of white lilies stood on pedestals, their heady scent permeating the air. A large photograph of Varga in performance, violin raised and expression transported, dominated the front of the room. Miss Marple sat beside Lady Agatha in the third row, her observant gaze missing nothing. Inspector Graves had positioned himself discreetly near the entrance, while his sergeant stood at the opposite doorway. The musicians who had been part of the reunion orchestra occupied the front rows, their faces sombre. Eloise Varga, elegant in black, sat apart, her beauty emphasized rather than diminished by grief or its appearance. As the attendees settled, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a slight figure slipping in through a side entrance. Clara Hartman had chosen to come after all, dressed simply in navy blue, her grey hair arranged neatly beneath a modest hat. She took a seat in the last row, her presence seemingly unnoticed by most. But Miss Marple saw how Clara's gaze fixed on the photograph of Anton, and the complex emotions that passed across her face: sorrow, anger, and something else, something more profound that spoke of a lifetime of carried pain. Henry Cunningham opened the proceedings with a brief eulogy, praising Anton's contributions to music and his courage in escaping wartime Europe to bring his art to England. Several colleagues followed with personal reminiscences carefully edited to emphasize Varga's talents rather than his temperament. Then came the music. A string quartet performed a movement from Dvořák, followed by a pianist playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which had been a favorite of Varga's. Finally, Maurice Hoffman rose and moved to the center of the small stage, cello in hand. "I will now perform an arrangement of La Vie en Rose," he announced, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed deeper emotions. This piece became one of Anton's signatures during the war years, bringing hope to audiences during dark times. As the haunting melody filled the hall, Miss Marple watched Clara Hartman. The woman sat perfectly still, her eyes closed, as if every note was simultaneously a balm and a knife. When the piece concluded, there was a moment of absolute silence before the polite applause began. In that moment, Miss Marple rose from her seat and, with a brief murmur of apology to Lady Agatha, made her way to the back row. She settled beside Clara Hartman, who opened her eyes and regarded her with resignation. "You've come to expose me," Clara said quietly, her voice barely audible beneath the continuing applause. "I've come to understand," Miss Marple replied. "The melody was beautiful, just as Jacob composed it. Your brother's talent lives on, even if his name has been forgotten." Clara's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat. "How did you know?" "Several small details that formed a pattern," Miss Marple explained gently. "The locket you wear, the same one visible in the photograph Anton kept all these years. The inscription Pour Toujours that appeared in the programme's dedication. A curious choice of French in an English text, and with the same misspelling that I glimpsed on your locket yesterday when you adjusted your collar." She paused as Henry Cunningham rose to make his closing remarks. "But what truly confirmed my suspicions was the programme itself. You arranged to help with the typesetting, didn't you? It gave you access to Meadowbank, allowed you to familiarize yourself with the staff arrangements." "I needed to see him," Clara whispered. "After all these years, I needed to look into his eyes and ask why." "And did you?" "Ask him, I mean." Clara shook her head slightly. "There was no opportunity. He didn't recognize me at first. Why would he? The pretty young girl he abandoned is long gone, but when he mentioned La Vie en Rose during his speech, when he claimed it as his own, without a single acknowledgement of Jacob," her voice faltered. "The champagne," Miss Marple prompted gently. "You had access to the serving trays." "It was meant for me as well," Clara admitted. "I intended to raise my glass with him to whisper Jacob's name as we both drank. A final communion, you might say. But at the last moment I couldn't join him. Even after everything, I wanted to live." She looked directly at Miss Marple. "Does that make me a coward?" "I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "it makes you human. Life asserts itself, even against our darkest intentions." Their quiet exchange was interrupted as Inspector Graves approached, having noticed their conversation. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily, then turned back to Clara. "The locket, Miss Hartman. May I see it?" After a moment's hesitation, Clara's fingers worked the clasp of the delicate chain. She removed the violin-shaped pendant and placed it in Miss Marple's palm. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside, just as she had expected, was a miniature photograph of Jacob Hartmann, and on the opposite side the inscription Pour toujours. The misspelling was subtle, and extras that would be noticeable only to someone familiar with French. "Anton gave you this," Miss Marple stated rather than asked, "before the war." "The day before he betrayed Jacob to the authorities," Clara confirmed, her voice hollow. "He couldn't risk Jacob escaping with me, not when my brother's compositions could advance his own career. Anton informed on him, took his music, and left us both to our fate." Her eyes darkened with remembered horror. "I survived the camps. Jacob did not. Neither did our unborn child." Inspector Graves had heard enough. With quiet dignity, he stepped forward. "Clara Hartmann, I'm arresting you for the murder of Anton Varga." Clara accepted this with a calm that suggested relief rather than despair. As she rose to accompany the inspector, she looked once more at Miss Marple. "He took my forever," she said simply. "Jacob's music was all I had left of him, and Anton claimed even that. Each time I heard La Vie en Rose played on the radio, announced as Anton Varga's arrangement, it was like losing Jacob again." As Clara was led away, the other attendees began to notice the commotion. Whispers spread through the gathering, faces turning in confusion and alarm. Miss Marple returned to her seat beside Lady Agatha, her expression thoughtful. "Was it really necessary, Jane?" Lady Agatha asked quietly. "After all she's suffered?" "Justice doesn't recognize a statute of limitations on murder, Agatha," Miss Marple replied. "And yet, I wonder if justice has truly been served in this sad affair." Anton lived 40 years with acclaim and wealth built partially on the talents of a man he betrayed. Jacob's life was cut short in the camps, his music attributed to another. And Clara lost everything, her brother, her child, the man she believed loved her, and now her freedom. She gazed at the photograph of Anton Varga, captured forever in his moment of artistic triumph. "Sometimes, Agatha, there are no neat resolutions, no tidy endings where all accounts are settled. Some wounds run too deep, some betrayals leave scars that never truly heal." As they departed Meadowbank for the last time, the strains of La Vie en Rose seemed to linger in the air, a melody of love transformed by time and tragedy into an elegy for all that had been lost. The beautiful house stood serene in the afternoon sunlight, its grand facade revealing nothing of the human drama that had played out within its walls. Like so many great houses Miss Marple had known, it kept its secrets close, witnessing the best and worst of human nature with the same impassive dignity. The case was closed, the culprit identified, the method established. Yet as Miss Marple settled into Lady Agatha's car for the journey back to Westfield Manor, she felt none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied the resolution of a mystery. Instead, she carried with her the image of Clara Hartmann's face as she surrendered the locket, a face that spoke of a life defined by a single, devastating betrayal, and of a love that had twisted slowly over decades into its dark mirror image. Some stories, Miss Marple reflected, ended not with justice, but with understanding. And sometimes understanding was the heavier burden to bear. Thanks for joining us for The Last Waltz at Meadowbank. Did you suspect Clara Hartmann before Miss Marple revealed the connection to the misspelled French inscription? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. Some wounds run too deep for time to heal, and justice isn't always as neat as we might wish. This is Alfie, signing off from Café Stories.